The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting golden streaks across Ethan Carter's front yard. He stood on his porch, hands in his pockets, admiring the gentle trickle of water from his newly installed decorative fountain. It wasn't much, just a 3-foot-tall stone piece, simple yet elegant, surrounded by a ring of vibrant marigolds and petunias. The sound of the water was soft, soothing, like a whisper of peace in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Grove. Ethan had moved here 2 years ago, drawn by the charm of its tree-lined streets and the promise of a peaceful life. Homeownership, to him, meant freedom to shape his space, to make it his own. He took a sip of his coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls. At 35, Ethan was a man who valued simplicity. He worked remotely as a graphic designer, kept to himself mostly, and took pride in maintaining his modest 2-story house. The fountain had been a small indulgence, a reward for a particularly good year. He'd spent weeks planning it, sketching designs late into the night, imagining how it would look against the backdrop of his manicured lawn. The neighbors had noticed too. Mrs. Delaney from across the street had stopped by the day before, smiling as she said, "It's lovely, Ethan. Really spruces up the place." He smiled at the memory, setting his mug on the porch railing. For a moment, everything felt right. The birds chirped overhead, the air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and the fountain bubbled quietly. It was the kind of morning that made you glad to be alive. That peace shattered the next day. Ethan stepped outside to grab the mail and froze. Taped to his front door was a bright yellow notice, the kind that screamed trouble even before you read it. He peeled it off, his brow furrowing as he scanned the text. Homeowners Association violation notice, it read in bold letters. Unauthorized water structures are prohibited per HOA guidelines, Section 5.3. Remove immediately or face fines of $100 per day. He blinked at the paper, then looked at his fountain. Unauthorized? It was barely 3 feet tall, hardly a structure. He'd seen bigger bird baths in the neighborhood. Shaking his head, he muttered, "This has to be a mistake." Ethan wasn't one to panic. He figured it was a simple misunderstanding, something he could clear up with a quick conversation. The Willow Grove HOA had never bothered him before. Sure, they had rules. Grass couldn't grow past 4 inches, no garish paint colors, but nothing unreasonable. He'd even attended a meeting once, a dull affair where people debated mailbox uniformity. The president, Margaret Hensley, had seemed strict but fair. Ethan assumed she'd see reason. He decided to appeal at the next HOA meeting, scheduled for that Thursday. Folding the notice, he tucked it into his back pocket and went about his day, confident he could sort it out. Thursday evening arrived, cool and crisp. Ethan walked into the Willow Grove Community Center, a squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. About a dozen residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring among themselves. At the head of a long conference table sat Margaret Hensley, a woman in her late 50s with a sharp jawline and a wide-brimmed sun hat she wore indoors like a crown. Her clipboard rested in front of her, a stack of papers neatly aligned. She looked every bit the self-appointed ruler of Willow Grove, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Ethan took a seat near the back, waiting for the agenda to reach new business. When his turn came, he stood, smoothing his shirt, and approached the table. "Hi. I'm Ethan Carter, 142 Maple Lane. I got a violation notice about my fountain. I just wanted to explain." Margaret didn't let him finish. She raised a hand, her voice cutting through as like a knife. "Mr. Carter, rules are rules. Section 5.3 clearly states that unauthorized water structures are prohibited. Your fountain violates that." Ethan frowned, keeping his tone calm. "I get that, but it's small, 3 feet tall, decorative. It's not hurting anyone. Some neighbors even said it looks nice, that it might boost property values." Margaret tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail. "Uniformity is what keeps this neighborhood respectable. Exceptions undermine the system. But there are other fountains on Maple Lane," Ethan pointed out. "At least 3 houses have them. Why's mine a problem?" Her lips curled into a thin smirk. "Those were installed before the updated regulations. Yours is new. It has to go." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome, but this felt personal. "Okay, fine. I'll take it down. But what's this about a fine?" Margaret's smirk widened. "You'll be charged $100 per day until it's removed. We've already filed it. The room went quiet. Ethan felt heat rising in his chest, but he wasn't the type to explode. Not yet. You're fining me before I even had a chance to appeal? Rules are rules, she repeated, her tone final. She waved him off, turning her attention to the next item on her agenda. Ethan sat back down, fists clenched in his lap. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior, but he held it in check. He'd play by her rules, for now. The next morning, he dismantled the fountain, hauling the stones to his garage with a scowl. It wasn't the money that bothered him, it was the pettiness. Margaret Hensley had made it clear, this wasn't about a fountain. It was about control. He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. A few days later, Ethan found another yellow notice taped to his door. He snatched it off, expecting some follow-up about the fountain. Instead, the text read, "Lawn ornaments exceed approved height limit per HOA guidelines, Section 7.1. Remove immediately or face fines." He stared at the paper, then at his yard. The offender was a garden gnome, a foot-tall ceramic figure with a pointy hat, nestled among his flower beds. He'd bought it on a whim at a flea market, thinking it added a bit of whimsy. Now it was a violation? He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was a pattern. Ethan remembered his first run-in with Margaret months before the fountain fiasco. It was at a block party, one of those forced neighborhood gatherings he'd attended out of politeness. He'd brought a pair of folding lawn chairs, bright blue, a little worn but comfortable. Margaret had walked by, clipboard in hand, and muttered, "Those don't match the aesthetic." He'd brushed it off, figuring she was just overly particular. But now, looking back, he saw it. She'd marked him that day. Maybe it was his casual dismissal of her rules, or maybe she just needed someone to bully. Either way, this was personal. He wasn't backing down. If Margaret wanted a fight, he'd give her one, on her own turf. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, a pot of coffee brewing, and pulled up the Willow Grove HOA bylaws on his laptop. The document was a slog pages of dense legalese about paint colors, fence heights, and trash placement. But Ethan was determined. He combed through it, line by line, looking for anything he could use. By midnight, he'd found gold. Margaret's own house wasn't flawless. Her fence was 2 inches taller than the 6-foot maximum. Her mailbox tilted slightly, violating the standard alignment rule. And her driveway? Cracked and faded, well overdue for the mandatory power washing outlined in Section 9.2. Ethan grinned, scribbling notes. If she could nitpick, so could he. The next morning, he filed 3 complaints against her, submitting them online with photos attached. Then he waited. It didn't take long. By noon, he spotted Margaret storming out of her house across the street, a stack of notices in her hand. She glanced at his porch, her face a mask of fury, and Ethan raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. For the first time, she didn't look smug. She looked rattled. But Margaret didn't retreat. She escalated. The following week, Ethan woke to the sound of voices in his yard. He stepped outside to find a team of HOA inspectors, 3 men in khakis with tape measures and notepads, poking around his property like detectives at a crime scene. They measured his grass, inspected his mailbox, even photographed his porch steps. Margaret watched from her own porch, arms crossed, a triumphant gleam in her eye. By Friday, Ethan received a new notice. $500 in fines for lawn non-uniformity, mailbox non-compliance, and excessive porch clutter, a single-potted plant. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his patience fraying. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was a vendetta. Margaret was weaponizing the HOA to make his life hell. He stood on his porch, the crisp morning air doing little to cool his anger. He tried reasoning with her, tried following her rules, and it had gotten him nowhere. If she wanted war, he'd change the game. He pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures, every fountain, gnome, and violation on Maple Lane that she'd ignored. Then he dove back into the bylaws, searching for a loophole. That's when he found it. Section 5.3 banned unauthorized water structures, but it didn't mention waterfalls. Nothing about cascading water features, no height restrictions, no permits required beyond city approval. Ethan's lips curled into a slow, deliberate grin. If Margaret didn't want a small fountain, she was about to get something much bigger. He spent the next day making calls, landscapers, contractors, city officials. By evening, he had a plan. Within a week, a crew arrived at his house, unloading massive slabs of stone and high-powered pumps. His front yard turned into a construction site, complete with excavators and blueprints. Neighbors gathered, whispering excitedly as workers dug into the earth, assembling something monumental. Margaret wasn't far behind. Ethan had barely stepped outside when she stormed up his driveway, clipboard raised like a weapon. "This is an unauthorized construction project," she screeched, her pen clicking furiously. "You didn't file for HOA approval." Ethan stayed calm, pulling a thick folder from under his arm. "Actually, I did." He handed it to her, watching as she flipped through it. City permits, environmental clearances, HOA submission forms, all approved before she could intervene. Her face twitched, shifting from rage to confusion to horror. She couldn't stop him. Not legally. This isn't over," she stammered, clutching her clipboard as she retreated. Ethan watched her go, a flicker of amusement in his chest. This wasn't just a win. This was checkmate. The waterfall took shape over the next week, a towering 15-foot structure of hand-carved rock, with water cascading down multiple tiers. Hidden LEDs lit it up at night, casting a soft glow across Ethan's yard. A koi pond bubbled at the base, surrounded by lush plants. It was breathtaking, a masterpiece of defiance. And the best part? It was 100% legal. Margaret stood across the street as the final touches were added, her fingers trembling on her clipboard. For years, she'd ruled Willow Grove with an iron fist, her word law. Now, Ethan had challenged her power, and she couldn't stand it. The fallout came fast. She called an emergency HOA meeting, rallying her most loyal board members, uptight retirees who nodded at her every word. Ethan attended, sliding into a seat near the back. The room buzzed with tension as Margaret stood at the front, her voice sharp. "We're here to address a growing issue," she said, motioning to a new rule draft. "Excessively large and disruptive structures in front yards must be banned." Ethan waited, letting her finish her spiel. She turned to him, her lips curling. "Mr. Carter, you'll be required to remove your waterfall immediately." The board murmured, flipping through the paperwork. Ethan let the silence stretch, then stood. "Actually, no, I won't." He slid a folder across the table, city approval, time-stamped before her new rule. It didn't apply to him. Margaret's face drained of color. The HOA president, Harold Grayson, an older man who tolerated her more than he liked her, sighed and rubbed his temples. "He's right," Harold muttered. "The waterfall stays." Margaret's breath hitched. She slammed her clipboard onto the table and stormed out, the board adjourning in her wake. Ethan thought that might be the end of it. He was wrong. The next morning, a city inspector arrived, clipboard in hand. Margaret had filed a complaint, claiming the waterfall was an environmental hazard. Ethan met the man at the pond, watching as he examined the structure. Margaret hovered at the edge of the driveway, smug. After a thorough check, the inspector closed his notepad. "This is one of the best landscape features I've seen," he said, nodding at Ethan. "No violations here. Enjoy your waterfall." Margaret looked ready to explode. Ethan grinned. Checkmate again. Then something unexpected happened. The neighborhood took notice. Within weeks, water features sprang up everywhere. Ponds, fountains, even a second waterfall down the street. It was a rebellion, sparked by Ethan's stand. Margaret tried to fight back, issuing fines left and right, but people pushed back. At the next HOA meeting, the room turned against her. A woman demanded to know why her wind chimes were banned. A man questioned the brightness rule for patio lights. By the end of the night, a motion was made to vote for new leadership. Margaret's empire crumbled. Margaret resigned a week later, her house on the market within a month. The new HOA leadership rolled back her rules, and Willow Grove transformed. Fountains, lights, and laughter filled the streets. Ethan's waterfall stood proud, a symbol of victory. 2 months later, a letter arrived from a law firm. Karen was suing him, claiming the waterfall was a public nuisance. Ethan laughed, then called a lawyer. In court, he presented noise tests, city approvals, and neighbor statements, all in his favor. The judge dismissed the case, and Margaret stormed out, defeated. A final letter arrived from her. "Congratulations, you won. Enjoy it. I'm dealing with my own HOA nightmare now." Karma's funny like that. Ethan grinned, learning she'd moved to a stricter HOA. Poetic justice. Ethan sat on his porch, the waterfall's hum a constant companion. The neighborhood thrived, free from Margaret's tyranny. He'd won, and karma had finished the job. Reflecting on it all, he wondered, would you fight back like you did? He'd love to hear your stories.